Most of the cases we cover on this show happened within living memory. Tonight, we go further back, into the Shōwa era, the 6 decades of upheaval that carried Japan through war, occupation, and reconstruction. These 5 cases are history now, but not one of them is finished. We begin in 1938, in a dark mountain hamlet in Okayama, where a 21-year-old man killed 30 of his neighbors in roughly 90 minutes. The worst one-man killing spree in modern Japanese history. Then, occupied Tokyo, 1948. A polite stranger posing as a health official walks into a bank, and 12 employees are poisoned. A conviction followed, but the doubts around it never went away. A year later, the president of Japan's national railways vanishes from a department store and is found dead on the tracks. Whether it was suicide or murder has never been officially resolved. In 1963, a 16-year-old girl is murdered in Sayama, and the man convicted, Kazuo Ishikawa, spends 31 years in prison insisting on his innocence, a claim he maintained until his death. And in 1970, 9 young radicals armed with katana swords seize a domestic flight in Japan's first-ever hijacking, bound for Pyongyang. 5 cases, 1 era, and shadows that reach all the way to today. It's 1:30 in the morning on May the 21st, 1938. A remote mountain hamlet in Okayama Prefecture is completely dark. Someone cut the power lines 8 hours ago. A 21-year-old man steps out of his house. He has strapped 2 electric torches to his forehead. In his hands are a shotgun, a katana, and 2 daggers. An axe is on his belt. His grandmother is already dead behind him. He killed her first. What follows over the next 90 minutes is the worst one-man killing spree in modern Japanese history. By the time he reaches the hillside above the village and turns the gun on himself, 30 of his neighbors are dead. His name is Mutsuo Toi, and before he picked up those weapons, he was mostly known as the boy with tuberculosis, the one the women in the village had stopped speaking to. The hamlet of Kayo was small even by rural standards. In 1938, roughly 111 people lived there across about 23 households. Traditional wooden farmhouses packed in close along narrow mountain footpaths in Kamo village, Okayama Prefecture. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where your family history was common knowledge, where your illness was everyone's business. On the night of May the 20th, residents went to bed in darkness. Someone had cut the power. Most assumed it was some kind of fault in the line. Nobody panicked. It was a small, quiet village in wartime Japan. They were accustomed to bearing things without complaint. They had no way of knowing that the 21-year-old who lived among them had climbed the power poles himself that evening, around 5 p.m., and severed the electrical wires. He had been planning this for some time. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Mutsuo Toi killed his 76-year-old grandmother. She was the person who had raised him since he was a toddler, after both his parents died. He left notes that explained why he did it. He could not bear, he wrote, to leave her alive to carry the shame of being a murderer's grandmother. He killed her to protect her from what was coming. Then he stepped outside, strapped the 2 electric torches to his head, and began moving through the village. What he did next, moving from house to house in complete darkness, visible to his victims only as a beam of light before the shots came, lasted until roughly 3 a.m. By the end, he had entered approximately 11 homes and killed 30 people. 3 more were seriously injured. The weapons he used were a Remington shotgun, a katana, 2 daggers, and the same axe he had used on his grandmother. When it was over, he climbed the mountain above the hamlet. He sat down and wrote one final note. Then he shot himself. He was 21 years old. To understand how Mutsuo Toi arrived at that night, you have to understand what his life looked like in the months before it, and what it looked like for a young man in rural, wartime Japan in the late 1930s. He was born on March 5, 1917, in a village not far from Kayo. His parents both died of tuberculosis when he was still a toddler, and his grandmother took him in and raised him and his sister. By all early accounts, he was a polite child, a diligent student. Nothing in his elementary school years suggested anything alarming. His family was not poor by local standards. They had land and some standing in the community. He was not, in that sense, a young man with nothing. But in May 1937, when Mutsuo was 20 years old, he appeared before the Military Conscription Board. Japan was at war in China. For a young man of his generation, military service was not just expected. It was the primary avenue of social worth. To be drafted was to be counted among the living participants in the national project. To be turned away was a different kind of statement. The board classified him Grade C, unfit for military service. The reason? Tuberculosis. It is difficult to overstate what that diagnosis meant in rural 1930s Japan. Tuberculosis was not simply a medical condition. It carried profound stigma, connected in many communities to notions of physical impurity, to the idea of something morally compromised in the person or the bloodline. In Shinto-influenced rural culture, illness of this kind was understood not just as disease but as taint, and it was contagious, which made it something people wanted to stay away from. When word spread that Mutsuo Toi had tuberculosis, his neighbors pulled back, and the withdrawal was, by his own account, most devastating from one group in particular, the young women of the village. In rural Japan at that time, a practice known as yobai, night crawling, was still observed in some mountain communities. It was an ancient custom in which young men would slip into women's homes after dark, seeking sexual encounters. It was informal, it was consensual by the conventions of the time, and it was, in that particular world, a form of social participation, of belonging, a way of being woven into the fabric of the community. Mutsuo Toi had participated in yobai, and then the diagnosis came and the women stopped receiving him. They turned him away. The doors stayed closed. His notes described the rejection in plain, bitter language. The women had cut him off entirely, and he interpreted it as a verdict on his very existence. Over the following year, his isolation deepened. His health made heavy agricultural work impossible. His military rejection barred him from the one honorable path a young man of his time was supposed to walk. The social connections he had, limited as they were, dissolved one by one. Somewhere in that year, he began to plan. The power cut on the evening of May the 20th was deliberate and calculated. He climbed those poles hours before the massacre, in the early evening, removing the advantage of light from the entire community. The torches he strapped to his head would give him vision in the dark, while his victims had none. He had thought about how this would work. He had prepared his weapons. He had written 2 of his 3 notes before he killed anyone. Left them on a table at home, where they would be found. This was not a sudden collapse, it was a decision. What drove Mutsuo Toi past the point of no return was not one thing. It was a stack of losses, each one compressing the next. The death of his parents to tuberculosis when he was too young to remember them. Being raised outside the conventional family unit, without a father or mother, in a world where that shaped everything about your standing. And then his own diagnosis with the same disease that had taken them. That particular cruelty, inheriting the illness that orphaned you, would not have been lost on him. Then the military rejection. In wartime Japan, in 1937, with the fighting intensifying in China, with national mobilization at fever pitch, to be unfit for service was to be publicly declared inadequate. Your peers were going to war, you were staying home. That was not a neutral position, it came with judgment attached. And then the women. The withdrawal of the one remaining form of social connection he had. His notes suggest that what finally broke him was not the tuberculosis itself. He had known he was sick, he had lived with it for a year, but the behavior of the people around him once they knew. The coldness, the closed doors, the whispers. He directed his rage outward, at his neighbors. But his notes also contain something complicated, the killing of his grandmother as an act of love, or what he believed was love, the one person he still wanted to protect, spared from what she would have had to face as the relative of a mass murderer. He had thought that through. He was not lost in delusion. He knew exactly what he intended to do and what it would cost. In his mind, the world had made him what he was. He believed he had been wronged, and he believed the only exit available to him was this one. Let me be clear that what follows is interpretation, not clinical diagnosis. There is no psychiatric record of Mutsuo Toi. He died before anyone could examine him professionally. What we have are his notes, the facts of his life, and what the witnesses and historians who have studied the case have concluded. What the notes reveal is someone consumed by what we might call annihilatory shame, a sense that he had been reduced to nothing, that the things that made him a person, a man, a participant in community life, had been stripped away. Not just that he was sick, that he was nothing because he was sick. In rural Japanese society of that era, identity was almost entirely relational. You existed in relation to your family name, to your role in the household, to your place in the social fabric. Toy was already fragile, orphaned young, raised outside the conventional family structure, without the anchoring his peers had from birth. When the tuberculosis came, it didn't just threaten his health, it severed every remaining thread. The response, in retrospect, follows a pattern that researchers of extreme violence have identified. Overwhelming shame, combined with a sense of profound injustice, combined with the belief that death is the only available resolution. When a person becomes convinced they are going to die, whether from illness or from their own hand, the calculations change. The violence becomes, in their distorted reasoning, a settling of accounts before exit. The torch detail is worth sitting with, moving through that village in the dark, house to house, using his lights to see while his neighbors were blind. It is, in its terrible way, a grotesque echo of Yobai. Creeping through the dark, moving from door to door, doing in violence what he had been refused in life. Whether that was conscious or unconscious in his planning, no one can say. But it is striking. The specific ritual of exclusion, the closed doors in the night, became the shape of his final act. What made him a mass murderer rather than a man who took only his own life? His notes suggest he needed the world to know what had been done to him. He wanted to be witnessed. The village had treated him as invisible, as a person whose existence no longer quite counted, and he refused to leave invisibly. The 30 people he killed were the proof that he had been there all along. That desire to be seen, in the end, was what killed them. The Sayama massacre was suppressed during the war years. Japan in 1938 had no interest in publicizing a story about a sick young man who had been broken by his community and destroyed it in return. There were battles to be celebrated, sacrifices to be honored. This was a different kind of story, the wrong kind. It resurfaced slowly, and through fiction first. In 1949, the mystery novelist Seishi Yokomizo published a novel called The Village of Eight Graves. Loosely inspired by the case, set in a mountain community haunted by a historical mass killing from its own past. The book became one of his most celebrated works and has been adapted for film and television multiple times. In 1983, the director Noboru Tanaka made a more direct dramatization of the events, a film called Village of Doom. At least 4 books have examined the case in some form. There was a stage play. The massacre kept returning in culture because it resisted easy explanation. It was not the work of a cult. It was not ideological. It was not random in the way that some violence is random. It came out of something local and specific, a community's treatment of one of its own, and the person that treatment produced. Japan in the 1930s was a society under intense pressure. Wartime mobilization, national unity demanded from above, no space for the person who could not participate. Mutsuo Toi was a man for whom every exit had closed. The tuberculosis, the conscription board, the women, the neighbors, each one shut a door. What remained in his mind was this. For nearly 44 years, the Tsuyama massacre held the record as the worst one-man killing spree in recorded history. In 1982, that record was broken by a similar act in South Korea in which 57 people died. Tsuyama moved to second place on a list that no one wants to be on. Most people outside Japan have still never heard of it. The hamlet of Kayo was never the same afterward. The community that had held 111 people across 23 households was gone, shattered by grief and by the weight of what had happened on those footpaths in the dark. The mountain above the valley where Toi climbed and wrote his final note is still there. The narrow paths between the old farmhouse sites still exist. The village itself is barely inhabited today. There is something worth thinking about in all of this that has nothing to do with excusing what he did. because nothing excuses it, and everything to do with what we owe each other. Tuberculosis in 1930s Japan was incurable and terrifying, but the ostracism attached to it was a series of social choices made by individual people. The women who turned away, the neighbors who whispered, a conscription system that stamped a young man's worth on a card. None of them intended to produce a massacre. All of them contributed to a man who came to believe he had no place left in the world. That is not a verdict on them. It is an observation about how isolation works, and about what can happen when it goes deep enough and long enough and no one reaches back. It doesn't always end in violence. Most of the time, it doesn't. But sometimes it does. Thank you for watching. If these stories, the ones that fell between the cracks, that didn't travel beyond Japan's borders, that the history books skipped, if these matter to you, please consider subscribing. Every new subscriber means another story gets told. I'll see you in the next one. January 26, 1948. A well-dressed man steps into a bank branch in Toshima Ward, Tokyo, shortly after the bank has closed to the public. He says he's a government health official. He says a dysentery outbreak is moving through the neighborhood, and everyone in the room, every single employee, needs to take preventive medicine immediately. 16 people comply. 12 of them are dead within the hour. The man takes the cash from the vault, folds it into his coat, and walks out the door. What follows is one of the most contested criminal cases in Japanese history. A case where the official verdict and the probable truth may be very different things, and where the shadow of one of Japan's darkest wartime secrets reaches all the way into the conviction. Japan in January 1948 was a country rebuilding itself from nothing. World War II had ended 2.5 years earlier. The Allied occupation, centered on General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo, controlled nearly every dimension of daily life. Food rationing was in effect. The black market was the only market that felt real. Tokyo, firebombed nearly flat in March 1945, was still being reconstructed, block by block. Into this dislocated city came a crime unlike anything the Tokyo Metropolitan Police had seen. The Teikoku Bank, its name means Imperial Bank, had a branch in the Shiinamachi neighborhood of Toshima Ward in western Tokyo. On January 26, 1948, in the mid-afternoon, just after the branch had closed its doors to customers for the day, a middle-aged man in a western suit arrived. He was neat in appearance and unhurried. He wore a name tag. He presented himself to the branch manager as Tajiro Yamaguchi, a public health official from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. He said he was operating under orders from General Headquarters, MacArthur's Occupation Administration. His message was urgent. A group of American soldiers had recently passed through the area, he explained, and there was now a confirmed dysentery outbreak nearby. Every member of the bank staff needed to take preventive medicine immediately. He had it with him. 16 employees were in the branch. Not one of them questioned him. In post-war occupied Tokyo, a uniformed official claiming to act on GHQ orders was not someone you refused. Disease prevention campaigns had been real, visible, and recently conducted in that very part of the city. The request seemed, in that moment, entirely plausible. The man set out small cups. He administered what he described as a first medicine, a clear or lightly colored liquid. He told the employees they needed to follow it quickly with a second medicine to ensure absorption. They drank both doses without hesitation. Within minutes, people began collapsing. The convulsions came fast. Employees fell from their chairs onto the floor against each other. 12 of the 16 died of poisoning. The exact compound used has been debated ever since the day of the attack, but the effects were consistent with a cyanide-based substance. 4 people survived. Some accounts suggest that a small number had consumed slightly less than the others or managed to spit some of the liquid out before swallowing fully. The man, meanwhile, walked to the back of the bank. He collected approximately 164,400 yen in cash from the vault and also took a check worth 17,400 yen. Then he left. He had been in the branch for perhaps 15 minutes. When the police arrived, they found 12 people dead and 4 barely alive. They also found something else. The man had left behind 2 business cards. Cards bearing the names of real public health officials who worked for the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. When those officials were tracked down, They had no knowledge of anything that had happened at Shinamachi. What investigators gradually pieced together was that January 26th was not the first time. The perpetrator had rehearsed. According to accounts established during the subsequent investigation, a man matching the general description had used the same method at the Yasuda Bank branch in Ebara, Shinagawa Ward, in October 1947, posing as a health official administering what he called preventive medicine. Nobody died in that incident. Several employees reportedly fell ill. A similar incident allegedly occurred at the Mitsubishi Bank's Nakai branch in Shinjuku Ward on January 19, 1948, exactly 1 week before Shinamachi. Again, no deaths. These are documented in the investigative record, though it's said that the connections between all three incidents were not fully established until after the Teikoku Bank attack. The pattern of escalation is striking. Someone was calibrating, adjusting the dose, refining the approach. In the final week between the Mitsubishi Bank visit and the Teikoku Bank attack, they got the concentration right. The question of what the poison actually was has never been settled to everyone's satisfaction. Prosecutors argued potassium cyanide, cheap, obtainable, widely used in wartime industries, including photographic processing, an industry Hirasawa was later linked to. But several chemists and pharmacologists who reviewed the case over the following decades raised a different possibility, that the compound was acetone cyanide, sometimes called acetone cyanohydrin, which releases hydrogen cyanide as it metabolizes in the body. The distinction matters because acetone cyanide was largely inaccessible to ordinary civilians in 1948 Japan. It was, however, available to certain former military scientists, particularly those who had worked on Japan's biological and chemical warfare programs during the war. As for the business cards, police traced them to public health campaigns that had been conducted in Tokyo in the months following the occupation's start. Real officials had distributed cards to citizens during those campaigns. To have obtained those specific cards, the perpetrator must have attended one of those campaigns in person and collected them. It's said that investigators identified hundreds of people who had participated. One of them was a 56-year-old tempera painter from Hokkaido named Sadamichi Hirasawa. Police also found that Hirasawa had come into an unusual amount of money in the period around the attack, spending patterns that stood out against his normal financial life. He was arrested on August 21, 1948, in Otaru, Hokkaido, 7 months after the killings. After extensive interrogation, lasting several months by most accounts, Hirasawa confessed. He was convicted of all 12 murders by the Tokyo District Court in 1950 and sentenced to death. He retracted his confession almost immediately. He spent the rest of his life saying he had not been there. If the motive was robbery, and the prosecution's argument was essentially that, then the Teikoku Bank affair was a brilliantly cold-blooded plan to take money from a bank without conventional confrontation. No gun, no threat, no violence visible to anyone outside the building. Just a false identity and a toxic substance that created the appearance of a medical emergency after the perpetrator was already gone. The stolen amount, 164,400 yen in cash plus a check, was not a fortune even by 1948 standards. But in a city where people queued for rationed rice and many families survived on informal arrangements, it was real money. Tokyo in the immediate post-war years had been stripped of industrial capacity, and much of the pre-war middle class had been effectively erased. The circumstances that could produce a calculated, practiced crime of this kind, desperation or the knowledge that opportunity existed and that the surveillance conditions were weak, were broadly present. The method, however, tells us something beyond simple need. This was not opportunistic. The choice of a public health cover story was precise. Occupation Japan had real disease outbreaks, real GHQ-mandated health campaigns, and a culture of deference to official authority that the killer understood and exploited. The earlier bank visits were not coincidental. They were fieldwork. Set aside for a moment the question of guilt. Focus on the psychology of the crime itself, because it's unusual even within the category of premeditated murder. Whoever committed the Teikoku Bank killings was not acting in anger. There was no outburst, no breakdown, no visible emotional distress. What the attack required, and what every witness account confirms, was theatrical calm. A composed, authoritative performance delivered to 16 people at once, sustained without visible nervousness, timed with enough precision to allow for both doses to be administered before the first deaths began. The rehearsal visits make this stranger, not simpler. The perpetrator practiced not just the dosage, but the role. They returned to the method until it produced the result they wanted. That is not the behavior of a person acting from rage or desperation. That is the behavior of a person who approached mass killing as a technical problem. This is precisely why the Unit 731 theory has remained so persistent for so long. Unit 731, designated the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, was the Imperial Japanese Army's secret biological and chemical warfare division based in Harbin, Manchuria. Its members had conducted experiments on human subjects in controlled conditions. They had administered poisons, observed the effects, and in some cases framed those administrations as medical treatment. The members of Unit 731 had, in the most literal and terrible sense, practiced exactly this. In 1947, General MacArthur granted immunity from war crimes prosecution to the members of Unit 731, including its commanding officer, General Shiro Ishii. In exchange, the United States received the unit's experimental data. Dozens of former military scientists re-entered Japanese civilian life under this arrangement, their wartime work officially unexamined. It's alleged, though this has never been officially confirmed, that when certain investigators began developing leads pointing toward former Unit 731 members as plausible perpetrators of the Teikoku Bank attack, those lines of inquiry were shut down by occupation authorities unwilling to expose the immunity arrangement. What can be said without allegation is that no former Unit 731 member was ever formally investigated for the crime. The novelist Seicho Matsumoto explored this argument extensively in his 1960 work, Nihon no Kuroi Kiri, Black Mist over Japan, contending that the real perpetrator was a former biological warfare scientist protected by MacArthur's deal, and that Hirasawa was convicted in his place. Matsumoto's theory has not been officially confirmed and may never be. Every person who could have known the truth with certainty is now dead. What can be confirmed is the record of what happened to Sadamichi Hirasawa after his conviction. He appealed to the Tokyo High Court in 1951 and lost. He appealed to the Supreme Court in 1955 and lost. He filed 29 separate requests for retrial over the following decades. All 29 were rejected. Not a single justice minister, across successive governments spanning 4 decades, was willing to sign the execution warrant. Under Japanese law, the minister must personally authorize each execution. The official silence around Hirasawa's case was never explained, but it was sustained for 37 years. He was transferred from Sendai prison to a prison hospital in Hachioji, Kanagawa, in his final years, as his health declined. He died there of pneumonia on May 10, 1987. He was 95 years old. He had been convicted of 12 murders he denied committing. Spent more than 3 decades waiting for a hanging no one would authorize, and outlived nearly everyone connected to the case. His adopted son, Ichiro, continued fighting for a retrial until his own death in 2013. The Teikoku Bank affair leaves you with a particular kind of unease. Not the closure that even the most terrible criminal cases can eventually provide, but a sustained and unresolved weight. 12 people went to work at a bank in western Tokyo on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in January 1948 and never came home. Their deaths were real, the grief of their families was real, the crime itself, the meticulous planning, the false authority, the cold precision of it, happened exactly as the evidence shows. What isn't clear is whether the man who spent 37 years on death row was the man who committed it. The evidence against Hirasawa was circumstantial. His confession was retracted almost immediately. No physical evidence placing him inside the Shiinamachi branch has been publicly established. And behind all of it sits the shadow of Unit 731 and the immunity deal that may have protected the real perpetrator from ever being named. Japan's post-war legal system was new and imperfect, operating under occupation conditions that constrained what could be investigated and who could be charged. The same occupation that brought democratic reforms to Japan also, allegedly, inserted a blind spot into this case, a zone of immunity where investigators were told not to look. The case was officially closed with Hirasawa's death. No alternative suspect was ever charged. The man who walked into Shinamachi branch on January the 26th, 1948, and handed out cups of poison was never in any court identified by name. If this story stayed with you, if you want to keep exploring the cases and systems that shaped modern Japan, please consider subscribing. There's much more ahead. July 5th, 1949. Sadanori Shimoyama, the most powerful railroad man in Japan, stepped out of his company limousine in central Tokyo. He was going to buy his wife a birthday present at the Mitsukoshi department store, one of the most famous shops in the country. He walked through the door, he never came out. 12 hours later, just after midnight, his body was found on the tracks of the Joban line in northern Tokyo, severed, mangled, destroyed by a passing train. But here is the detail that turns a tragedy into a mystery. When investigators examined the scene, there was almost no blood. Not at the tracks where his body lay, not anywhere nearby. A man doesn't get struck by a high-speed locomotive and leave almost no blood behind, unless he was already dead when he got there. Was it suicide? Was it murder staged to look like a train accident? Was it something that powerful forces in post-war Japan needed buried quickly? The Shimoyama incident is one of this country's most fiercely debated unsolved cases, and it has never been resolved. Not officially, not ever. To understand what happened to Sadanori Shimoyama, you have to understand the world he was living in. Japan in 1949 was a country still under foreign occupation, rebuilding from the ash of World War II. The Allied powers, led by the United States, governed the country through GHQ, General Headquarters, under General Douglas MacArthur. And in 1949, GHQ had shifted direction sharply. What historians call the reverse course was now in full swing. A crackdown on left-wing unions, communist-affiliated labor groups, and anything that might give the Japanese left political leverage during a deepening Cold War. Mao's forces were weeks away from taking Beijing. Korea would be at war within a year. In this climate, Shimoyama was handed a poisoned appointment. He was born on July 23, 1901. A career bureaucrat from the Ministry of Transport, methodical and capable, the kind of man who got things done. On June 1, 1949, he was named the first president of Japanese National Railways, JNR, the newly formed public corporation that would manage Japan's entire rail network. He had been in the job exactly 35 days when he disappeared. The problem was what his job required him to do. Under the Dodge Line, a sweeping austerity policy imposed by American banker Joseph Dodge to stabilize Japan's post-war economy, the railways had to shed workers. Tens of thousands of them. On July 4, 1949, Shimoyama's office published a list of approximately 30,000 employees who would be dismissed. Many were union members, many had communist sympathies, and many were understandably furious. That same day, it is reported that Shimoyama received threatening letters. The next morning, July the 5th, he left home as usual. His company car took him toward the office. Somewhere near Nihonbashi, in the heart of central Tokyo, he asked his driver to stop. He got out. He said he wanted to pick up a birthday gift for his wife at the nearby Mitsukoshi department store, and that was the last time anyone from his office ever saw him. Hours passed. He didn't arrive at work. His secretary called. No answer. Staff searched. Nothing. As July 5th turned into July 6th, the situation became desperate. And in the earliest minutes of July 6th, around 12:30 in the morning, rail workers found his body on the Joban Line tracks, between Kitasenju and Ayase stations in northern Tokyo. The body had been struck by a train. It had been dismembered by the impact. What no one could explain was what it was doing there. The forensic findings that followed did not settle anything. They deepened the mystery. The first person to examine Shimoyama's remains at the scene was a police medical inspector named Shinosuke Yasushima. His on-the-spot assessment was that the injuries were consistent with a person being alive when the train hit, that the train itself was the cause of death. In other words, suicide. Shimoyama had walked to the tracks and lay down, but the formal autopsy reached the opposite conclusion. The official post-mortem determined that Shimoyama had already been dead before any train touched him. He had been killed elsewhere, and his body had been transported to the Joban Line and placed on the tracks. Those two findings, from two different examiners on the same body, could not both be true. The physical evidence leaned toward the murder interpretation. The near absence of blood at the scene was a significant anomaly. When a living person is struck by a high-speed train, blood is expected at the site. The pattern here suggested death had occurred elsewhere. The distribution of injuries raised questions. Medical professors from other universities challenged the methods of the original autopsy. And in a detail that some investigators found telling, detectives from an unconventional and unexpected precinct were assigned to lead the case, bypassing the more logical jurisdictional choices. The investigation fractured along institutional lines. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police concluded suicide. The Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's Office concluded murder, and reportedly believed that U.S. occupation forces may have been involved. The two agencies investigated simultaneously, pulling in different directions, undermining each other's work. Documents were disputed. Witness accounts shifted. The evidentiary picture grew muddier with each passing month. No one was charged, no definitive cause of death was ever officially declared. And in 1963, 14 years after the incident, Japan's statute of limitations on murder ran out for this case. Without a prosecution, without a verdict, without so much as an agreed-upon cause of death, the Shimoyama incident became legally closed. Permanently. Three theories have competed for more than 75 years. The first is suicide. Shimoyama was, by any measure, a man under crushing pressure. He had been placed in charge of an institution and immediately ordered to shatter tens of thousands of careers. The dismissal list came from GHQ. Shimoyama was simply the face on it. It said that in his final days he seemed withdrawn, unable to sleep, visibly distressed. In the moral framework of his era, one shaped by duty, shame, and institutional responsibility, a man who caused such harm might choose death as an act of accountability. The at-the-scene medical examiner supported this view, and Tokyo police held to it. But the absence of blood argues against it, and suicide by train, while not unheard of, was a strange choice for a man of Shimoyama's stature who had many quieter options. The second theory is murder by radical labor union elements. The unions inside JNR were organized, politically motivated, and angry. When 30,000 firing notices went out on July the 4th, the response was explosive. The mainstream union leadership did not advocate violence, but it's alleged that fringe elements within the communist-aligned faction may have seen Shimoyama as a legitimate target. This theory found support, or at least was loudly echoed in what happened next. 9 days after Shimoyama's body was found, on July 15th, an unmanned JNR train had its throttle tied open and was sent at speed into Mitaka Station in Tokyo, killing 6 people and injuring 20 more. On August 17th, rail tracks in Fukushima were deliberately sabotaged, causing a derailment that killed 3 railway workers. The Matsukawa incident. These became known as Japan's 3 great railway mysteries of summer 1949. In both the Mitaka and Matsukawa cases, union members were arrested and prosecuted. Many were later acquitted on appeal, and many historians now believe the evidence against them was fabricated or manipulated. Which brings us to the third theory, the one the prosecutors reportedly found most credible, and the one that remains the most unsettling. Some investigators pointed the finger at GHQ, at American counterintelligence or connected rightist elements working with the occupation authorities. Under this theory, Shimoyama was killed, his body staged on the tracks to suggest suicide or accident, and the subsequent Mitaka and Matsukawa incidents were either carried out or manipulated by the same forces to provide a pretext for cracking down on the Japanese left. In other words, the Americans may have used the chaos of the summer of 1949, including the death of the man carrying out their own orders, to destroy the union movement. This scenario would explain why both Mitaka and Matsukawa led to convictions that later unraveled. It would explain why the Tokyo prosecutors suspected occupation involvement while the police insisted on suicide. 2 agencies receiving pressure from different directions. It would explain why the investigation was ultimately suppressed rather than resolved. And it would explain why no documents have ever emerged to close the case definitively, even after decades of declassification. Whether or not this theory is correct, it is this: it cannot be ruled out. That, in itself, says something about what Japan looked like under occupation in 1949. There is no clinical portrait to offer here, no perpetrator to analyze because we don't know who the perpetrator was, or even if there was one. What there is instead is a portrait of a man and an era. If Shimoyama took his own life, the psychology is one of a person who had absorbed and been broken by the weight of institutional responsibility. He was not the architect of the Dodge Line, he was its instrument. The orders came from above, from foreign occupiers who had remade Japan's economy to serve Cold War policy priorities. And he was the one whose name appeared on the dismissal notices, whose face the dismissed workers saw. The gap between his formal authority and his actual powerlessness may have been, in the end, the thing that destroyed him. A man who appears to hold great power but is actually carrying out someone else's decisions is in one of the more psychologically corrosive positions there is. You absorb the hatred, and you can't change the outcome. If he was killed, then the psychology that matters is not his, but that of whoever ordered it. A cold calculation that his death was more useful than his life, either as a message or as the opening move in a larger political operation. What strikes most people who study this case is the silence that followed. In Japan, a country where institutions tend to pursue certainty, where there is almost always an arrest, almost always a verdict, the Shimoyama incident produced nothing: no charge, no suspect named, no cause of death acknowledged. The legal mechanism simply ran its 14-year clock and shut itself off. That kind of institutional silence is not the same as ignorance. Someone, somewhere, knew enough to ensure that the question was never answered. Whether that person acted out of self-preservation, political calculation, or loyalty to a larger power, the silence became its own kind of answer. Japan's summer of 1949 was one of the most turbulent periods in the country's modern history. The new Railways Corporation barely 6 weeks old, 30,000 people losing their jobs in a single announcement, communist-affiliated unions fighting for survival, American occupiers pulling the strings from behind a formal civilian facade. 3 men died at Mitaka Station, 3 rail workers died at Matsukawa, and the first president of Japan's national railway was found in pieces on the Joban line, a man who had simply gotten out of a car to buy his wife a birthday present. We don't know what happened in those missing hours. We may never know. The Shimoyama incident resists resolution in a way that most crime stories don't. There is no arrest, no trial, no conviction, not even an agreed-upon cause of death. What the case gives us instead is a window into a particular and often overlooked chapter of Japanese history. The post-war occupation years, when the country was being rebuilt, reshaped and redirected by foreign hands, and when the pressures of that process could produce, depending on what you believe, either the private breakdown of one man or the deliberate elimination of a political liability. Writers and filmmakers have returned to this case for decades. Seicho Matsumoto, one of Japan's most acclaimed mystery novelists, was drawn to it. A film, Willful Murder, was made in 1981. Manga artist Naoki Urasawa wove the Shimoyama incident into the fabric of his graphic novel Billy Bat. It keeps pulling people back because it refuses to let go. At the center of it is a question that Japan never officially answered. Who decided that Sadanori Shimoyama should not come home from that department store? And why was the answer so important to someone that it had to be buried forever? He was 47 years old. He had been president of Japanese National Railways for 35 days. If this case stayed with you, the political intrigue, the forensic contradictions, the layers of an occupied country at war with itself, the rabbit hole goes deep. The Mitaka and Matsukawa incidents, the declassified GHQ records, the accounts that kept surfacing and disappearing over the decades. This is history that still matters. Thank you for watching. Share this with someone who'd want to know. I'll see you in the next one. On May 1st, 1963, a 16-year-old girl walked home from school in a quiet city north of Tokyo and never arrived. A ransom note arrived at her family's door that night. The police set up a trap to catch the kidnapper. He came, he got away, and 3 days later, the girl's body was found buried in a field. Under enormous public pressure, police needed someone to blame. They turned their attention to a neighborhood where people from Japan's most marginalized community lived. Within weeks, they had their man. The only problem is, he almost certainly didn't do it. Kazuo Ishikawa spent 31 years in prison. He was sentenced to death. He maintained his innocence every single day until he died at 86 years old, in 2025, just a few months ago. And the physical evidence that put him there? A published scientific study has now dismantled the most important piece of it. This is the Sayama incident, one of Japan's most bitterly contested wrongful convictions, and a story about what happens when a justice system decides who the guilty party is before it has looked at the facts. Sayama City in 1963 was a modest place in Saitama Prefecture, a farming region turning slowly suburban as Tokyo expanded north. It was the kind of community where a high school girl could walk home alone without anyone thinking twice. On the afternoon of May the 1st, Yoshi Nakata, 16 years old, a first-year high school student, left school and headed home. She never made it. That evening, a letter arrived at her family's house. It was a ransom note. The writer demanded some £200,000 in cash, roughly $550 at 1963 exchange rates, and ordered Yoshi's family to bring the money to a location near their home at midnight the following night. Police were alerted and surrounded the meeting point with plainclothes officers. Yoshi's older sister was sent to carry the money to the spot. A man did approach her. He exchanged a few words, and then, for reasons that have never been fully explained, he sensed something was wrong, turned, and vanished into the dark. The officers at the scene could not catch him. This was a disaster for the Saitama Prefectural Police. The media criticized them ferociously. And it wasn't even their first failure that spring. Just 1 month earlier, they had also failed to apprehend a suspect in a separate kidnapping case in the same region. 2 public failures in quick succession. The pressure from both the press and politicians was enormous. On the morning of May 4th, police found Yoshi Nakata's body. She had been buried in a shallow grave in an alley running through farmland. An autopsy confirmed she had been raped and strangled. A teenage girl was dead. The man who had done it was gone. Yoshi's older sister, the woman who had carried the money to the midnight handoff, who had spoken to the killer and watched him walk away, would later take her own life, the grief apparently insurmountable. The entire family had been destroyed in 3 days, and the Saitama police, humiliated and desperate, needed a result. What happened next is where this case becomes something darker than a murder investigation. In Sayama City, there was a Buraku community there, a neighborhood inhabited by people from Japan's historical outcast group, a group that had faced systemic discrimination for centuries and continued to face it in 1963, despite formal legal equality. Police launched what has been described as a sweep of this community. Not, supporters argue, because any evidence pointed there, but because of a deeply rooted assumption that violent crime was more likely to come from this kind of district. On May 23rd, 22 days after Yoshi disappeared, police arrested 24-year-old Kazuo Ishikawa. He was Buraku-born from this neighborhood. The charge they used to bring him in was unrelated to the murder, a separate matter entirely, used as a pretext to get him into custody. Ishikawa had grown up in poverty. He had received almost no formal education. By all accounts, he was functionally illiterate, unable to read or write complex text, let alone the kind of sophisticated, kanji-heavy sentences in the ransom note. But none of that stopped what came next. He was held for 47 days. Under Japanese criminal procedure at the time, a suspect could be detained for extended periods before formal charge, with severely limited access to an attorney. Ishikawa's lawyer was reportedly permitted only 5-minute visits. Meanwhile, Ishikawa was subjected to interrogation sessions lasting 16 to 17 hours a day. His supporters and his own account, and I want to be clear that these are disputed and denied by prosecutors, describe 2 specific tactics used to break him. First, it's alleged that investigators threatened to arrest his older brother, who was the main breadwinner for the family. Second, it's alleged that they promised him, "Confess, and you'll be freed within 10 years." On June 20th, Ishikawa confessed. He claimed he and 3 other men had kidnapped and killed Yoshi Nakata. The following day, he drew a map showing where Yoshi's school bag, which had not yet been found, was buried. Police found the bag at the location the map indicated. Then came the physical evidence. On June 26th, police found a fountain pen at Ishikawa's house, at the lintel, tucked above the doorframe. This pen was said to be the victim's. On July the 2nd, they found the victim's wristwatch. Those 3 elements, the confession, the map, and the recovered items, formed the spine of the prosecution's case. There was no DNA testing in 1963. There were no fingerprints of Ishikawa on the ransom note or on its envelope. And the ransom note itself had been written by someone clearly comfortable with complex Chinese characters. A level of written literacy Ishikawa simply did not have. His defense team raised this from the very beginning. In 1964, after a trial lasting roughly 6 months, Urawa District Court found Ishikawa guilty and sentenced him to death. During the appeal, Ishikawa retracted his confession in full. He said it had been coerced, that investigators had coached him through a version of events until he could recite it consistently. He denied ever killing Yoshi Nakata. The Tokyo High Court listened and then commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment, while refusing to overturn the conviction itself. The Supreme Court upheld the result. The question of who actually killed Yoshi Nakata in May 1963 has never been answered. The man who fled from her sister at the midnight handoff was never identified. No other suspect was ever publicly named or charged. What we can say clearly is that the Sayama Prefectural Police were under severe institutional and public pressure to produce a result. The media had humiliated them. Politically, they were exposed. And into that pressure came an opportunity. A Buraku man who could be arrested on an unrelated pretext and held long enough for a confession to be obtained. The Buraku Liberation League, Japan's central organization for the rights of the outcast communities, described Ishikawa's arrest almost immediately as a discriminatory indictment. Their argument was not subtle. Police had not come to the Buraku district because the evidence led there. They had come because of who lived there. When you look at the specific evidence problems, it is genuinely difficult to dismiss that argument. A man who cannot write kanji. A ransom note requiring someone who can. No fingerprints of Ishikawa on either the note or its envelope. A fountain pen found tucked above a door frame. A watch recovered separately. An alleged promise of freedom in 10 years. A promise that never came. Ishikawa served 31 years before parole. Then, decades later, a piece of hard scientific evidence emerged that supporters say changes everything. Researchers applied X-ray fluorescence analysis, XRF, to the actual physical evidence held at the prosecutor's office. The key finding, Yoshi Nakata's own handwriting samples and personal pen contained chromium in the ink, measured at between 65 and 112 parts per million. The fountain pen found at the lintel of Ishikawa's house, the pen the prosecution identified as the victim's pen, contained no detectable chromium whatsoever, less than 1 part per million. They were different pens. If the pen found at Ishikawa's house were genuinely the victim's pen, it would share the same ink chemistry as her known writing. It did not. Ishikawa's supporters argue this proves the pen was not Yoshi's at all, and was placed there, by whom and when remains unresolved. The defense lawyer's position, held across decades and multiple retrial applications, was that the watch, the pen, and the map to the school bag were all fabricated or manipulated to support a predetermined conclusion. The XRF findings, they argue, confirm what they had always maintained. Kazuo Ishikawa's case is, on one level, a textbook study in false confession, and false confessions are considerably more common than most people want to believe. Research in forensic psychology consistently shows that extended detention combined with sleep deprivation, social isolation, threats against people the suspect loves, and false promises of leniency can produce confessions from innocent people. The mind under sustained stress begins to fragment. 47 days of 16-hour interrogation sessions with 5-minute lawyer visits is not an edge case. It is an extreme that most people would not survive with their certainty intact. But there is something specific to Ishikawa's situation that makes it even more legible. He was illiterate and had almost no experience with legal institutions or formal authority. The investigators questioning him held enormous power in a society where deference to authority was deeply embedded, and he was told, if this account is accurate, that someone he cared about, his brother, would face punishment if he did not give the interrogators what they wanted. When you add that to his educational disadvantage, to his isolation, and to the sheer duration of the pressure, a false confession does not become puzzling. It becomes almost predictable. What is particularly haunting is what the confession apparently meant to him. If the promise of freedom in 10 years was genuine, and I want to stress again this is alleged, then from Ishikawa's perspective, confessing may have felt like a survivable decision. A terrible one, but survivable. What he could not have anticipated was that he would be sentenced to death, that the sentence would eventually be commuted, and that 10 years would become 31. The broader social dimension of the case is this. Japan's Buraku community had experienced generations of institutional discrimination in housing, in employment, in marriage, and in the courts. There is documented evidence from other cases of police directing disproportionate attention toward Buraku districts when crimes occurred nearby. In that context, Ishikawa's arrest does not look like a random error born of desperation. It looks like a pattern of the system reaching for the nearest available outsider when it needed to produce someone. None of this diminishes the tragedy of what happened to Yoshi Nakata. A 16-year-old girl was killed. Her family was destroyed. Her sister, who had walked to that midnight handoff carrying fake money while police waited in the shadows, later took her own life. That grief was real, regardless of who the courts found responsible. But it is possible to hold two things at once. The genuine horror of a young life cut short, and the genuine possibility that in the chaos and pressure that followed, an innocent man was taken and destroyed by a system that had decided what it needed to find before it began looking. Kazuo Ishikawa died on March 11, 2025. He was 86 years old. He had served 31 years in prison, been released on parole at 55, and spent the 3 decades that followed fighting for a retrial that never came in his lifetime. 3 retrial applications were rejected. When he died, the 3rd application died with him. His wife, Sachiko, filed a 4th retrial request with the Tokyo High Court in the months after his death, continuing a fight that had now outlasted the man who began it. Japan's retrial system is, by international standards, extremely difficult to access. A conviction is extraordinarily hard to reverse, even in the face of new forensic evidence. Critics have argued for years that the system is built to treat finality as a value in itself. That once convicted, a person remains convicted, because reopening cases damages institutional credibility. The Sayama case did not change that system during Ishikawa's lifetime. What it did change, slowly and in ways harder to measure, was the public conversation about Buraku discrimination and about the reliability of confessions obtained under extended detention. The case became a central rally point for the Buraku liberation movement for more than 60 years. It is studied in Japanese law schools. It is cited in international human rights reports to the United Nations. Alongside the Hakamada case, where a man spent 48 years on death row before being acquitted in 2024, the Sayama incident is one of the 2 cases cited most often by scholars who argue that Japan's justice system conflates conviction with truth. We may never know who killed Yoshi Nakata on that May afternoon in 1963. The man who walked away from her sister at midnight was never found. If Ishikawa didn't do it, and the evidence, read carefully, raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered, then whoever did is either long dead or has spent 60 years in silence with that knowledge. What remains is a 31-year imprisonment, an 86-year struggle, a fountain pen with the wrong ink, and a conviction that still stands. If you stayed with this story, thank you. These are not easy ones. The cases that stay with you longest are usually the ones without a clean resolution, and this is emphatically one of them. If this channel is something you find valuable, subscribing keeps this work going. And I'll see you in the next episode. It was a Tuesday morning in Tokyo, and by every surface measurement, Flight 351 was a nothing flight, a short domestic hop from Haneda Airport to Fukuoka, 2.5 hours at most. 122 passengers, a crew of 7, a plane called the Yodo. About 12 minutes after takeoff, 9 young men stood up from their seats throughout the cabin. They were carrying katana swords. One of them was 16 years old, still in high school. Another was holding what was described as a homemade bomb. They told the pilot to fly to North Korea. And then things got stranger. March 31st, 1970. The Yodo, a Boeing 727, the name meaning still water, lifted off from Haneda Airport at 7:33 in the morning. The flight was scheduled to take less than 3 hours. It ended up taking 4 days. The 9 hijackers were members of the Red Army faction, or Kiyosando Sekigun-ha, a radical student group that had splintered from the Communist League and concluded that the time for marches and petitions was over. They ranged in age from 16 to 27. Their leader was Tamiya Takamaro, 27 years old, a veteran of campus protests. The youngest was Yasuhiro Shibata, 16, a second-year high school student who had boarded the plane with a sword hidden in his belongings. They were armed with katana swords and what the investigation described as a homemade explosive device. 12 minutes after takeoff, they stood and announced they had seized control of the aircraft. Their demand was simple: fly them to Pyongyang, North Korea. They called this operation the opening move of a communist revolution. The pilot diverted to Fukuoka, telling the hijackers the plane needed to refuel. On the ground at Fukuoka, some passengers managed to get off. Japanese authorities tried to negotiate at the gate. The hijackers refused to stand down. Eventually, the plane took off again and flew northwest towards South Korea. What the 9 did not know was that Japanese and South Korean authorities had been in contact. In the hours while the plane was on the ground in Fukuoka, something quietly extraordinary was being arranged at Gimpo Airport in Seoul. When the Yodo touched down at Gimpo, the hijackers looked out the windows. The signs were in Korean. Soldiers stood on the tarmac in military uniforms. The hijackers stepped off the plane, believing without question that they had arrived in Pyongyang. South Korean airport authorities had repainted visible signage and positioned military personnel to create the surface appearance of a North Korean military facility. The deception held for 3 days. During those 3 days, passengers were gradually released in exchange for concessions: fuel, tire repairs, assurances. By the end of the Seoul standoff, all 122 passengers had been freed. And then, Japan's Vice Minister of Transport, Shinjiro Yamamura, did something that no one had ordered him to do. He walked voluntarily onto the aircraft and offered himself as a replacement hostage. In exchange, the last civilians were allowed off. Yamamura remained on board as the plane prepared to fly north for real. Eventually, the deception came apart. Japanese newspapers were showing photographs of Gimpo tarmac and calling it Seoul. The hijackers were reportedly shown the papers and refused at first to believe them. It said that it was only through contact with actual North Korean officials, and perhaps the creeping inconsistencies of the staged environment, that they finally accepted the truth. They had been in Seoul the whole time. And still they pressed on. On April 3, 1970, the Yodo crossed the 38th parallel. It landed at Mirim Airport, on the outskirts of Pyongyang. North Korea received the 9 as revolutionary heroes. They were given military honors, political asylum, and accommodation in a secure compound that later accounts describe as the Village of Revolution. Vice Minister Yamamura and the remaining crew were released on April 5th and flew back to Japan. The 9 stayed. What made the hijacking possible, on the most practical level, was the near-total absence of weapons screening on Japanese domestic flights in 1970. The 9 boarded a short domestic route, Tokyo to Fukuoka, one of the most routine in the country, carrying katana swords and explosive materials without triggering any alarm. This was Japan's first-ever aircraft hijacking. The security infrastructure that we now take for granted, the scanners, the checked bag protocols, the no-fly considerations, did not exist here. The Red Army faction had planned the operation over weeks, possibly months. They chose their seats deliberately, distributing themselves across the cabin so that when they stood simultaneously, there was no obvious focal point for crew or passengers to rush. They chose a domestic route because the shorter distance meant lighter oversight and faster access. The choice of North Korea as their destination was entirely ideological. Kim Il-sung's regime had positioned itself as a sponsor of international revolutionary movements, and the Red Army faction had concluded that North Korea would train them militarily and help them launch a guerrilla return to Japan. They had imagined themselves as the vanguard of a coming revolution. The Gimpo deception was the authorities' answer. South Korean and Japanese officials had little time to construct it. What they built, repainted signs, repositioned soldiers, was rudimentary. But it held for 3 days, and it held long enough to free all 122 passengers. Whether it was ever designed to prevent the plane from ultimately reaching North Korea is unclear. It may simply have been a way to buy time. What is remarkable about the standoff is not the deception, but what came after it. Vice Minister Yamamura's voluntary decision to board. There was no protocol for this. He walked on because he believed it would free the last hostages. He was right. He came home. To understand why 9 young people walked onto that plane with swords, you have to understand Japan in 1970. The country was in the grip of one of the most intense student radical movements in its history. The US-Japan Security Treaty, ANPO, had divided the country for a decade. In 1960, hundreds of thousands of people had taken to the streets when Prime Minister Kishi pushed the treaty's ratification through the Diet. By 1970, the treaty was up for renewal again, and the anger had compounded. Japan was also watching the Vietnam War escalate under American direction. Many in the student movement saw Japan's alliance with the United States as direct complicity. The Red Army faction was the most extreme edge of that movement. Where mainstream student groups believed in organizing and mass protest, the faction had decided that armed action was the only meaningful response. They were inspired by Palestinian militant groups, by Cuba, by Mao's Cultural Revolution. They had adopted the language of revolution in absolute terms. Compromise was collaboration. Passivity was surrender, action was everything. Most of the 9 were students or recent students. They were not from desperate poverty. Several had been involved in campus protests before concluding that protests weren't enough. What they shared was a closed social world in which every conversation reinforced the same set of conclusions and in which a 16-year-old could pick up a sword because everyone he trusted said that this was what the moment required. They believed they were making history. They believed North Korea would train them and send them back. They believed the revolution was close. There is something almost impossible to sit with about what the Yodo-go hijacking became, because it didn't end in victory or martyrdom. It ended, slowly, over decades, in complicity. The 9 who boarded that plane were operating inside a closed ideological loop. Radicalization initiated in a tight-knit group rarely announces itself as madness. What it looks like from the inside is clarity. The logic is internally consistent. The conclusions follow from the premises. The outside world, family members who expressed concern, fellow students who refused to take up weapons, authorities who tried to negotiate, had all been categorized as either enemies or cowards. Doubt, by the time action was taken, had been fully socialized out of the group. Kim Il-sung's regime read this dynamic immediately and knew exactly how to exploit it. The 9 were celebrated. They were given weapons training, military status, accommodation, recognition. For the first years, it said that the hijackers genuinely believed they were still working toward revolution in Japan, that Pyongyang was a transit point, not a final destination. But the years passed, the revolution did not come, and North Korea had other uses for men who spoke Japanese, understood Japanese culture, and were too far outside the law to go home. 8 Japanese women were brought to Pyongyang through deception to become wives to the hijackers. How exactly this was arranged is not fully documented, but it is alleged that at least some of the women were told they were traveling overseas for work or study. They arrived in North Korea and could not leave. Their existence in Pyongyang was concealed from Japan for years. It wasn't until 1992, when Kim Il-sung casually revealed it during a meeting with a Japanese newspaper delegation, that Japan learned the hijackers' wives had been there all along. And it didn't stop there. Some sources allege that the hijackers and their wives participated in operations designed to lure additional Japanese nationals from European cities to North Korea in the 1980s. 3 young Japanese travelers who disappeared while abroad in Europe are among the 13 Japanese abductees formally acknowledged by the North Korean government in 2002. The men who had hijacked that plane to liberate Japan from imperialism had become, over the course of 2 decades, instruments of one of the most repressive states on Earth. Whether they rationalized this to themselves, whether the revolutionary framework could stretch far enough to justify what they were doing, is something we don't know. The closed ideological world that had made them capable of action in 1970 may have continued to provide cover for what came after. What we know is what they did. Of the 9 young men who boarded the Yodo on the morning of March 31, 1970, the fates diverged in ways that stretch across 5 decades. Yasuhiro Shibata, the 16-year-old student, the youngest of them all, eventually traveled back to Japan on a false passport in 1988. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served his sentence. He is the only member of the group who has faced a Japanese court for the hijacking itself. Yoshimi Tanaka was arrested in Thailand in 2000, reportedly found in possession of counterfeit American currency. He was returned to Japan and prosecuted. Tamiya Takamaro, the leader, died in North Korea. The exact circumstances remain unclear. It's said that he died in the 1990s, and there are accounts suggesting he fell out of favor with Kim Jong-il's government after Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, that his views were no longer compatible with the new leadership. This isn't confirmed. The fate of another member, Takeshi Okamoto, is disputed. Some accounts say he was killed while attempting to escape North Korea. Others leave his end ambiguous. The remaining members are believed to still be in North Korea. In 2004, surviving hijackers reportedly sent a letter to the North Korean government asking for assistance in arranging their return to Japan. Japan's police have kept outstanding arrest warrants active for those who have never been prosecuted. No one else has come home. The Yodo-go hijacking was the first aircraft hijacking in Japanese aviation history. It happened in a country with no anti-hijacking protocols, no airport screening, no framework for what to do when someone stands up in a domestic cabin with a sword. Japan built all of that in the years that followed, but the human cost of those 4 days in 1970 was paid not only by the passengers on the plane, all of whom survived, or by Vice Minister Yamamura, who volunteered to stay and also came home. The cost continued to be paid for decades afterward by the Japanese women brought to Pyongyang without consent, and by the young travelers who vanished from European streets and never returned. 9 young men went to North Korea to start a revolution. The revolution never came, and for most of them, the country they went to never let them leave. If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin, subscribe. We tell one of these a week. There's always more beneath the surface.